Hey guys, tonight we are easing into something slow, cold, and oddly comforting in a very inconvenient way. So go ahead and dim the lights, get settled, maybe pull the blanket up just a little higher than usual. Because tonight we are heading back to a time when winter was not a vibe, not an aesthetic, and definitely not something you posted about online. Tonight, we're talking about frontier families, the kind of people who looked at frozen wilderness and said, yeah, we can live there. Of course we can. And then spent the next several decades absolutely suffering through it. This is one of those stories that isn't exciting, isn't heroic in a loud way, and doesn't really have a beginning or an end. It just sort of exists, like winter itself, long, quiet, unforgiving, perfect bedtime material. So imagine, if you can, a night so cold that the air itself feels heavy. The kind of cold where sound doesn't travel properly, where your breath feels like it might crack if you inhale too sharply. Frontier winters weren't just colder than what most people experience today. They were lonelier, darker, and deeply uninterested in whether you were prepared or not. These families were often miles from the nearest neighbor, living in small cabins that leaked air like a sieve, with children, livestock, and existential dread all packed into the same space. And somehow they survived. Not comfortably, not happily, but consistently enough to keep doing it year after year, which is frankly alarming. Most frontier families didn't arrive with a detailed survival plan. They arrived with optimism and maybe a pamphlet. And that optimism usually wore off around the first real winter night when the fire died down and the walls started whispering cold at you. Cabins were usually built quickly, using whatever timber was available. Logs were stacked, gaps filled with mud, clay, moss, or whatever substance was closest and vaguely sticky. This process was called chinking, which sounds quaint, but really meant smearing wet dirt into cracks while hoping it didn't immediately freeze and fall out. Spoiler alert, it often did. Inside these cabins, everything revolved around the hearth. The fireplace wasn't just a place to cook or sit dramatically, it was the only thing standing between the family and becoming a cautionary tale. Fires were kept burning almost constantly in winter. Letting it go out overnight was a genuine risk because restarting it meant either using precious matches or flint, both of which were not infinite resources, or begging the cold gods for mercy. Families slept in shifts sometimes, especially during severe cold snaps, just to make sure someone was awake to feed the fire, which really adds a layer to the idea of a good night's sleep. Beds were positioned as close to the hearth as possible. Children often slept together, not out of affection, but out of thermal necessity. Body heat mattered a lot. If you had grandparents in the house, they were usually placed nearest the fire because age and cold are not friends. Mattresses were filled with straw, corn husks, or feathers if you were doing particularly well in life. Blankets were layered aggressively. Wool, furs, patched quilts, whatever could block even a fraction of the cold air creeping in through the walls. And even then, people often slept in their clothes, sometimes multiple layers, because undressing in winter was a bold choice. Let's drift over to clothing for a moment, because frontier fashion was not about looking good, it was about not dying. Wool was king. Linen existed, cotton was a luxury, and wool itched like it was angry at you personally. But it retained heat even when damp, which was important when everything was damp all the time. People wore multiple layers, often the same garments day after day, week after week. Washing clothes in winter was difficult and sometimes dangerous because water froze, soap was scarce, and hypothermia was always waiting politely nearby. So cleanliness took a seasonal break. Everyone smelled like smoke and livestock, and no one talked about it. Children were wrapped in oversized clothes, sometimes handed down through several siblings. Sleeves were rolled, hems dragged, and nothing fit correctly. But warmth mattered more than dignity. Babies were swaddled tightly and kept close to adults. Infant mortality was high even in good conditions, and winter made it worse. Families did what they could, which often meant improvisation layered on top of superstition. If something seemed to help once, it became tradition. Logic was optional, survival was not. Food was another quiet battle. Winter meant no fresh crops, no foraging, and very limited hunting depending on conditions. Everything eaten during winter had been prepared months earlier: salted meat, smoked fish, dried beans, root vegetables stored in cellars or buried pits, bread made from coarse flour. Meals were repetitive and heavy. Calories mattered more than flavor. A good stew could last days, reheated over and over, thickening into something new and deeply unidentifiable by the end. Everyone ate it anyway. Complaining burned energy. Animals were part of the winter strategy too. Livestock was often brought into or very near the house, not because anyone enjoyed sharing space with a cow, but because animals produce heat. Barns were sometimes attached to cabins or built close enough that body warmth helped keep temperatures marginally higher. Chickens, pigs, goats, whatever you had, they were part of the thermal ecosystem. The smell was intense. The benefits were measurable. Survival again took priority over comfort, aesthetics, and sanity. Let's gently slide into the emotional side of all this, because winter on the frontier was not just a physical experience, it was psychological. Days were short, darkness came early and lingered. Snow muffled sound, isolating families even more than usual. People didn't go anywhere unless they absolutely had to. Visits stopped, news stopped, time slowed down in a way that feels unfamiliar now. Families passed evenings by mending clothes, shelling corn, telling stories, or just sitting quietly. Silence wasn't awkward. It was expected. Children learned early how to stay busy without toys. Toys were rare and fragile. Instead, they helped with chores, practiced reading if books were available, or listened to adults talk about the past. Oral history mattered. Stories filled the dark. Some were comforting, some were warnings, some were just ways to hear another voice besides the wind pressing against the walls. Illness was a constant worry. A simple cold could turn serious when heat was inconsistent and nutrition was limited. Remedies were homemade: teas from dried herbs, poultices, prayers, sometimes all three at once. Doctors were far away and expensive. Many families relied on knowledge passed down, some effective, some questionable, all used with confidence, born of necessity. Fever during winter was especially dangerous. Keeping someone warm without overheating them was a delicate balance, and one that was often guessed at rather than understood. Sleep itself was different. People went to bed earlier because candles were precious and darkness was unavoidable. But sleeping through the night was not guaranteed. Fires needed tending, babies cried, wind howled, snow shifted on the roof in ways that sounded suspiciously like something watching you. Most people learned to rest lightly, waking easily, always aware of the cold. Deep sleep was a luxury. And yet, despite all this, frontier families developed a rhythm. Winter was not fought so much as endured. It was expected, planned for, feared, but also accepted. People knew it would come and that it would eventually leave. Spring was a promise, even when it felt distant and theoretical. That promise kept people going through nights where frost formed on the inside of windows and breath fogged the air indoors. As we continue, we'll drift deeper into the strange routines, quiet resilience, and slightly unhinged coping mechanisms that made frontier winter survival possible. For now, just sit with the image of a small cabin, fire crackling low, snow pressing in from all sides, and a family doing nothing dramatic at all. Just surviving, slowly, calmly, one cold night at a time. As the nights dragged on, frontier families became experts in small adjustments, not innovations exactly, more like quiet tweaks made out of desperation. A scrap of cloth stuffed into a crack, a board leaned against the door, a pile of snow packed deliberately against the outside wall, not because it looked nice, but because snow, ironically, is an insulator, which feels unfair, but winter has always enjoyed irony. People learned quickly that fighting the cold directly was exhausting. Instead, they learned to negotiate with it. You don't beat winter, you compromise and hope it doesn't notice you too much. Cabins themselves evolved over time, though slowly. Early frontier homes were often one room structures. Everything happened in that single space: cooking, sleeping, eating, dying occasionally. Smoke filled the room constantly because chimneys were imperfect at best. Eyes watered, lungs adapted or didn't. Over time, families figured out that a slightly better chimney meant less smoke and slightly more oxygen. This was considered a major upgrade. Windows were small, sometimes just oiled paper stretched over a frame. Glass was rare and fragile. Light came in reluctantly. Cold came in enthusiastically. At night, families blocked windows with shutters or extra fabric, not for privacy. Privacy was not a frontier priority. It was about trapping heat. Every surface mattered. Floors were often dirt, sometimes packed hard, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. Rugs were rare. Cold crept up through the ground, through boots, through bones. People learned to sit with their feet tucked under them or resting on small stools near the fire. Children were told not to sprawl. Sprawling wasted heat. Cooking during winter was a slow ritual. Fires burned lower to conserve wood, which meant meals took longer. Pots simmered for hours, sometimes all day. Bread baking was planned carefully because heating the oven used extra fuel. Families often cooked several things at once to maximize the heat already being used. Efficiency wasn't a buzzword, it was survival math. You learned quickly how much wood a meal cost. Fuel itself was a constant concern. Wood had to be chopped and stored long before winter arrived. If you underestimated how much you'd need, winter noticed. Chopping wood in deep cold was brutal. Tools broke. Fingers went numb fast. People layered gloves or mittens, often homemade, and worked in short bursts. Children helped as soon as they were able, hauling smaller pieces, stacking them near the house. A well stocked woodpile was a source of genuine comfort. Families counted logs the way modern people check weather apps. Lighting was dim, candles were precious. Tallow candles smelled vaguely like regret and burned unevenly. Oil lamps were better but required oil, which wasn't always available. Many evenings were spent in near darkness, with only firelight flickering across the walls. Shadows moved. Faces looked older in that light. Time passed slowly. People talked less. Silence filled the gaps without complaint. Winter also changed how people moved their bodies. Work slowed, but it didn't stop. Tasks shifted indoors. Repairing tools, mending clothes, sharpening blades. These were repetitive, calming motions. Hands stayed busy to stay warm. Idleness was uncomfortable because sitting still meant getting cold. Even rest involved movement, rocking, shifting, standing closer to the fire than was strictly safe. Burns were common. They healed slowly in winter. Children learned patience early. There was nowhere to go and little to do. Outdoor play was limited to brief bursts, heavily bundled, faces wrapped in scarves. Frostbite was a real threat. Ears, fingers, toes. Parents watched closely, calling children inside at the first sign of numbness. Crying from cold was taken seriously. Toughness had limits. Winter enforced them. Education didn't stop entirely, but it slowed. If books were available, children practiced reading by firelight. Writing was harder because ink froze, quills stiffened, hands cramped. Lessons were informal, woven into daily life. Counting supplies, measuring grain, listening to stories that doubled as moral instruction. Schoolhouses existed in some areas, but winter attendance was unreliable. Travel was dangerous. Staying home was safer. Let's gently wander into the subject of snow itself, because snow was both enemy and tool. Deep snow blocked paths, isolated families, and buried landmarks. But it also provided insulation. Snow packed around foundations helped keep cabins warmer. Snow was melted for water when wells froze. Snow reflected light, making days brighter even when the sun was low. Children sometimes enjoyed snow briefly, sledding on crude boards, laughing quietly before cold drove them back inside. Joy existed, but it was scheduled around survival. Storms were endured rather than tracked. There were no forecasts. Signs were read from the sky, the wind, animal behavior. A sudden stillness could mean a storm was coming, or nothing at all. When storms hit, families stayed inside, fires burning steadily, listening to wind batter the walls. Roofs creaked, snow piled up. Doors were sometimes blocked entirely, trapping people indoors for days. This was inconvenient, but not surprising. Supplies were rationed, calm was maintained, panic wasted energy. Mental resilience mattered. People developed habits to keep spirits steady. Routine was one. Morning tasks, midday meal, evening quiet. Rituals helped mark time when days blurred together. Some families prayed regularly, others sang softly. Music was simple: fiddles if you were lucky, voices if you weren't. Sound filled the space, pushed back the silence just enough. Loneliness was a constant companion. Even within families, winter could feel isolating. Tempers flared, arguments happened. Cabin fever wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. People snapped over small things, then apologized quietly. Everyone understood the pressure. Emotional survival was as important as physical warmth. Older family members told stories of past winters, worse winters, harder times. Whether or not these stories were accurate didn't matter. They reframed the present. This winter might be bad, but not as bad as that one time when everything froze and someone lost a boot. Perspective was a coping tool. As winter dragged on, people watched for signs of change. Slightly longer days, softer snow, drips from the roof. These were celebrated quietly, not loudly. Winter wasn't gone yet, but it was weakening. Hope returned in small increments. For now, though, we remain in the deep cold, the kind that presses in gently but persistently, the kind frontier families accepted as part of life. No drama, no heroics, just adaptation, patience, and a fire that must not go out. We'll keep drifting forward through more nights, more routines, and more quiet strategies that made survival possible. Just keep listening. Let the cold stay outside. By the time winter settled fully into its longest phase, frontier families were no longer reacting to it. They were inside it. Days blended together in a way that made calendars feel theoretical. Monday felt like Thursday, felt like maybe February, but no one was entirely sure. Time was measured less by dates and more by supplies. How much flour was left, how low the woodpile had sunk, how often the fire needed feeding overnight. This wasn't boredom exactly, It was a low, steady sameness that pressed gently on the mind. Nightfall came early, and with it a particular kind of stillness. Once the fire was set low and the last small tasks were done, families settled into a kind of communal pause. People sat, mended, watched flames. Children grew drowsy fast in winter, lulled by darkness and routine. Adults followed not long after, because staying awake burned candles and calories. Going to bed early wasn't laziness, it was strategy. Sleep, however, was never fully restful. The cold made itself known in small ways. A draft brushing a cheek, a sudden chill at the feet, someone waking briefly to add a log to the fire, moving carefully so as not to wake everyone else. Beds creaked. Straw shifted. Outside, the wind sometimes carried sounds that felt louder at night. Trees cracking, ice shifting, animals moving just beyond the light, nothing threatening, just present. Dreams during winter were often vivid. People talked about it later, casually, as if it were normal, which it was. Long nights and repetitive days gave the mind plenty of space to wander. Stories bled into sleep, memories resurfaced. Some nights were restless, others passed in heavy, dreamless dark. Waking in the morning wasn't marked by alarms or schedules. It happened when light crept in or when someone needed to start the fire again. Morning routines were slow. No one rushed into the cold. Layers were added carefully. Boots warmed near the hearth before being put on. Breakfast was simple and warm if possible. Porridge, bread, leftover stew. Eating something hot mattered. It set the tone for the day. Cold food in winter was tolerated, but never preferred. Water was another ongoing challenge. Wells froze, buckets iced over. Snow was melted in pots, slowly, carefully, because spilling meant losing effort. Water was conserved. Washing was minimal. Hands and faces were cleaned when necessary. Full baths were rare and often dreaded because drying off completely was difficult. Being damp in winter was dangerous. Health during these months was a balancing act. Too little movement led to stiffness and aches. Too much exposure led to illness or injury. People learned the limits intimately. A sore throat was monitored closely. A cough raised concern. Fevers were watched through the night. Remedies were administered with confidence, whether earned or not. Someone always knew a trick their grandmother had used. These were followed without question. Doubt didn't help. Children experienced winter differently. To them, it was both restrictive and oddly safe. The world shrank to the cabin and its immediate surroundings. Familiar, predictable. Parents were always close. Siblings shared space constantly. Arguments happened, but so did closeness. Winter forced togetherness. There was nowhere to escape to. Relationships intensified quietly. For older children, winter was a lesson in responsibility. They learned to read weather signs, to ration treats, to understand why certain things were off limits until spring. Patience wasn't optional. It was trained slowly, night after night. Let's drift briefly into the role of women during these winters, because their labor was constant and largely invisible. Cooking, mending, tending children, managing supplies, all while maintaining emotional balance in a confined space. There was little rest. Even moments of sitting were usually filled with work. Hands rarely stopped. Knowledge was passed down quietly. How to lay a bedding, how to stretch food, how to soothe a child without wasting energy. These skills weren't written down, they were absorbed. Men's work shifted too. Outdoor labor was reduced but not eliminated. Checking traps, caring for animals, repairing tools. When storms passed, snow needed clearing, paths reopened. This was heavy work, done carefully, Overexertion was avoided. Injuries healed poorly in winter. Everyone knew this. Community, when it existed, mattered deeply. Some families had neighbors within walking distance. Visits were rare but meaningful. Shared meals, news exchanged, help offered if someone was sick or supplies ran low. These interactions broke the monotony. They reminded people they weren't entirely alone in the cold. Travel was slow and cautious. A visit had to be worth the risk. For isolated families, letters were sometimes written but rarely sent until spring. Words were stored, not delivered. Journals filled with observations, weather notes, reflections. Some entries were mundane, others hinted at loneliness or fatigue. Writing was a way to stretch the mind when the world felt small. As winter edged toward its later stages, impatience grew. Supplies dwindled, tempers shortened. People watched the horizon more often, but they didn't rush it. Experience taught them that false springs were cruel. A warm day meant nothing. Winter liked to pretend it was done before, reminding everyone otherwise. So families waited, they endured, they kept routines steady and expectations low. This was the real secret of winter survival. Not strength, not bravery, just consistency. Doing the same small things every day until the season loosened its grip. We'll continue drifting forward soon into the slow emergence of late winter and the subtle shifts that signaled survival had worked once again. For now, stay here. The fire is steady, the night is long, and everything is exactly as it needs to be to make it through. By the time winter reached its later months, frontier families were tired in a very specific way, not the dramatic kind of exhaustion where people collapse and declare defeat. This was quieter, deeper, a bone level weariness that came from doing the same careful things for too long without relief. The novelty of survival had worn off weeks ago. Now it was just maintenance. Keep the fire going, keep everyone fed, keep spirits from sinking too low. Repeat. Late winter was often harder than early winter. Supplies were lower. Wood piles looked thinner than anyone liked. Food stores had been stretched creatively, which is a polite way of saying people were getting tired of eating the same thing over and over. Salted meat tasted saltier. Bread felt heavier. Treats safe for morale were gone or nearly gone. Families recalculated constantly. Could this last until spring? Probably. Hopefully. The cold itself changed slightly. Nights were still brutal, but days sometimes felt different. The sun lingered just a bit longer. Light reached corners of the cabin it hadn't touched in months. People noticed. They didn't celebrate loudly. They just noticed. A quiet acknowledgement passed between adults. We're getting there. Mornings were still slow, but there was more reason to get up. Tasks increased as people began preparing for thaw. Tools were checked. Seeds were counted and recounted, even though planting was still far off. Planning was a form of optimism. Talking about spring made it feel closer, even if snow still lay thick outside. Children sensed the shift too. They grew restless. Winter confinement had worn on them. They asked more questions. When can we go out? When will it be warm? Adults answered carefully, not too hopeful, not dismissive. Experience had taught them that promising spring too early was unkind. Health issues often peaked in late winter. Bodies were worn down. Nutrition had been limited for months. Minor ailments lingered longer. Healing was slow. Families watched each other closely. A cough that hadn't gone away raised concern. Someone losing weight unexpectedly was noticed. Care intensified. Extra portions were given when possible. Warmth was prioritized. Cabins by this point showed signs of wear. Smoke stains darkened walls. Floors were scuffed. Repairs that couldn't be done in winter were noted for later. People tolerated imperfections with patience. Complaining didn't fix drafts. Everyone already knew where they were. Snow management became its own routine. Roofs were checked carefully. Too much weight could cause collapse. Clearing snow was dangerous but necessary. This work was done slowly, methodically. Falls were avoided at all costs. A broken limb in late winter was a serious setback. Animals also showed signs of strain. Livestock were thinner. Feed was carefully rationed. Families balanced their own needs against the future value of their animals. Decisions were made quietly. Which animal could be spared if things got tight? These choices weren't discussed openly, but everyone understood them. Emotionally, late winter tested patience. Tempers flared more easily. Small irritations felt larger. People snapped, then apologized. There was an unspoken agreement to be forgiving. Winter had pushed everyone close to their limits. Grace was extended more freely. Evenings remained quiet, but conversations shifted. Instead of recounting past winters, people talked about what they'd do once the thaw came: repairs, travel, visits, work that had been postponed. These plans were modest, no grand dreams, just normal life resuming. Sleep improved slightly as nights shortened. Fires were still tended, but the burden felt lighter. Waking to faint morning light instead of total darkness lifted moods subtly. These changes were small but cumulative. They mattered. Then came the first real signs: snow softening during the day, icicles dripping steadily, mud appearing beneath the snow in patches. These were watched closely. People stepped carefully. Thaw brought its own dangers: flooding, rot, sudden cold snaps that refroze everything. Winter didn't leave politely, it lingered. But the knowledge that survival had worked again carried people forward. Another winter endured, another cycle completed. Frontier families didn't mark this with celebration, they marked it by continuing, by preparing for what came next. We'll keep drifting into this transition, where winter loosens and life slowly stretches outward again. For now, rest here in the in between. The cold is still present, but it's tired. And so is everyone else. As the snow softened and the days stretched ever so slightly, frontier families began to notice a subtle shift in the world outside. It wasn't dramatic. No one clapped or cheered. The change was gradual, like the slow tilt of light across a cabin wall. Roofs dripped quietly. Icicles lengthened and fell unexpectedly. Patches of mud appeared, dark and sticky, where snow had once dominated. It was messy, inconvenient, but undeniably a signal that winter was loosening its grip. Families adjusted accordingly. Boots that had been frozen into stiff shape softened. Paths that had been impassable all season opened, at least partially. Children ventured outside for longer periods, carefully, because the ground was uneven and waterlogged. Their excitement was muted but genuine. Adults kept a watchful eye. Spring wasn't to be trusted. Too early a celebration could be cruel. A late frost could undo weeks of preparation. Food routines shifted as well. Stored provisions were supplemented by early greens in sheltered spots or foraged shoots that poked timidly through melting snow. The first tender plants were handled carefully, not eaten all at once. Families rationed them wisely, appreciating the novelty and the taste, but always aware that full abundance was still weeks away. Breakfasts became slightly more varied, stews were lighter, bread still heavy, but sometimes supplemented by early foraged ingredients. Cabins themselves felt different. Damp crept in more easily as snow melted around foundations. Repairs became a priority. Roofs patched, walls reinforced. Gaps that had been tolerated all winter were now unacceptable because they invited water and drafts. People moved more deliberately, balancing caution with the slow relief that the cold had eased. Animals responded to thaw differently. Horses stepped more confidently outside, avoiding hidden icy patches. Chickens pecked at mud carefully. Livestock that had spent months clustered near the house now had slightly more space, although families remained vigilant. Feed was still rationed, but the return of some fresh forage lifted spirits for both humans and animals. Health improved gradually. Muscles stiff from months of minimal outdoor activity regained flexibility. Appetites adjusted. Sleep became easier as nights grew longer and slightly warmer. Emotional fatigue that had built up over winter began to lift imperceptibly. People felt lighter, though quietly, almost reluctantly, because experience had taught them that spring could still be harsh. Work began to change rhythm. Tasks that had been impossible during deep winter became feasible. Paths cleared, tools repaired, gardens readied, wells checked. These activities were done slowly, methodically, as though testing whether the earth would cooperate after months of frost. Nothing was rushed. Patience was still the guiding principle. Social interactions increased slightly. Neighbors emerged cautiously from their own cabins. Shared work, quiet visits, and the exchange of news began again. Letters that had been written months earlier were sent when possible. Conversation picked up in small increments, always measured, never exuberant. People had learned the quiet power of moderation. Children's routines expanded. They played more, cautiously exploring puddles and mud. Curiosity returned, tempered by awareness of slippery ground and lingering snowbanks. Lessons resumed in earnest. Reading, writing, basic arithmetic. But learning was now paired with observation of the changing world. Nature became a teacher, demonstrating thaw, renewal, and caution in equal measure. Emotional recovery was subtle. Tempers were shorter in winter, but patience returned slowly. Family interactions became gentler. Laughter, soft and restrained, began to punctuate the quiet hours. Complaints about food and chores decreased. Cooperation returned naturally because survival had forged habits of endurance and respect. Evenings remained quiet, but fires burned less intensely. Meals were prepared with care, but less urgency. Candles were still limited, but longer daylight meant fewer nights spent in near darkness. People could see each other more clearly. Faces that had been obscured by shadows all winter were revealed in the gentle, uneven light of early spring. Observing nature became a quiet pastime. Birds returned. Early buds emerged on trees. Snow melted in patches, leaving irregular patterns that required careful navigation. Families noted these changes without ceremony. It was an assessment, not a celebration. Survival demanded observation and adaptation more than festivity. By the time the first true warm days arrived, frontier families had adjusted to a new rhythm. Tasks expanded. Preparations for planting, repair, and travel became central. The world outside cabin walls was softer, more forgiving, but still demanding. The lessons of winter lingered in habits, routines, and cautious optimism. People moved more freely, but always with an awareness of what winter had taught them. Life resumed incrementally. Footpaths that had been impassable opened fully. Crops could be planted. Animals roamed more confidently. Families could begin to think beyond mere survival. Still, quiet vigilance remained. The season's challenges hadn't disappeared. They had transformed into more familiar, manageable work. Survival had shifted from urgent struggle to steady preparation. Even as winter faded, its imprint remained. Families remembered the long nights, the monotonous routines, and the slow adaptation required to endure months of cold. These memories informed spring. Decisions were made with caution. Planning was more precise. Habits formed during winter persisted because they had worked. Routine became a silent foundation beneath new growth. By now, A gentle calm settled over the household. Children played more freely. Adults worked steadily but without the frantic energy winter had demanded. Fires were tended but with a sense of leisure. Meals were prepared with care and variety. Conversation flowed slowly, reflecting the measured pace of life. The world outside was still demanding, but slightly less punishing. In this period, families felt the quiet satisfaction of having endured. No fanfare, no grand gestures, just the simple knowledge that they had survived the coldest nights. They had kept warm, fed, and alive. They had maintained cohesion, health, and a fragile sense of normalcy. The relief was soft and subtle, not loud or boastful. It was woven into the slow movements of daily life. As spring progressed, routines shifted further. Planting became a central activity. Preparation for summer work intensified. Children explored wider areas. Families repaired cabins and fences. Social interactions increased. Neighbors became regular companions again, sharing labor and resources. Community slowly reasserted itself after months of isolation. This gradual shift from survival to normalcy was not abrupt. It was measured, careful, and quietly triumphant. Life outside cabin walls began to matter again. Winter's dominance faded, but its lessons remained. Patience, routine, observation, and quiet endurance were remembered and carried forward. Survival had been achieved not through heroics, but through persistence, care, and subtle, ongoing effort. And so, frontier families moved into spring with soft relief. The long nights of cold had passed. Fires burned steadily but without urgency. Food was still necessary, but less constrained. Water flowed more easily. Paths were clearer. Animals moved more freely. People breathed a little easier, though quietly, as if acknowledging the endurance that had brought them to this point. In these first warm days, life expanded slowly. Families stepped outside with awareness and gratitude, not celebration. They were cautious, they were tired, they were alive. And for a frontier family, that was a profound achievement. Even as spring began to settle more firmly, frontier families carried winter's lessons like a shadow that stretched long into the day. The cold had left its mark not just on buildings, supplies, or routines, but on the very rhythm of life. People moved carefully, measured their actions, and avoided waste. Nothing was taken for granted because they had learned, often painfully, how easily survival could slip away. Morning routines blended preparation with observation. Adults checked cabins for drafts and water damage. Roofs were inspected. Foundations were examined for frost heaving. Walls were repaired slowly. Each task carried the memory of winter. Errors felt heavier. Lessons learned during months of cold were applied quietly and consistently. Food planning shifted with care. Stored provisions remained important, but anticipation of new crops grew. Gardens were tilled cautiously where frost still lingered. Early planting required restraint. Seeds were placed only where warmth and moisture were likely. Planting too early risked frost damage. Planting too late reduced harvests. Balance guided every decision. Children experienced spring as expanding space. Snowbanks receded, revealing mud, uneven ground, and early green shoots. They moved carefully, sometimes slipping, but enjoying freedom. Leçons posed during winter resumed. Reading, counting, and writing blended with observation. Learning became practical again through tracking growth, animals, and weather. Outdoor work became organized. Paths were cleared completely. Fence repairs began. Livestock were moved slowly to emerging pastures. Wells were cleaned. Troughs were refilled. The pace remained steady. Effort was balanced with caution. Exhaustion still carried risk, After winter, social routines increased quietly. Neighbors emerged more often. Small exchanges of tools, supplies, and news resumed. Information about weather and pests was shared. Travel stayed limited, but interaction increased. Community returned gently after isolation. Health improved gradually. Muscles stiff from winter regained strength. Minor injuries healed. Appetite stabilized. Sleep deepened, though rest was still measured. Emotional strain eased. Conflict softened. Relief remained controlled. Survival had been achieved, and confidence followed endurance. Cabins required constant care. Thawing ground revealed leaks and weakened floors. Repairs were deliberate. Every board and seam mattered. Shelters held lessons learned through winter. Maintenance became a quiet continuation of survival. Food routines grew flexible. Winter stores remained, but early greens and roots supplemented meals. Diets lightened. Stews changed with fresh additions. Children rediscovered forgotten flavors. Adults enjoyed variety without excess, aware that abundance could fade. Evenings stretched longer. Daylight reduced reliance on fire and candles. Conversation flowed more easily. Stories shifted towards spring plans rather than winter hardship. Thoughts turned to planting, fishing, and repairs. Hope remained calm and restrained. Animals showed relief. Chickens scratched softened soil. Horses moved confidently. Livestock regained strength after careful winter rationing. Families observed behavior closely. Survival depended on animals as much as people. Community cooperation expanded slowly. Trade and shared labor returned. Neighbors helped repair fences and exchanged tools and knowledge. These acts eased isolation. Trust rebuilt gradually, like planting crops. Children took on greater responsibility. They helped plant, care for animals, and assist with repairs. Lessons focused on timing and observation. Winter taught endurance. Spring taught foresight. Both remained essential. As the weeks passed, families fully settled into the rhythm of thaw. Survival was no longer an urgent daily struggle, but it remained a continuous discipline. Actions were thoughtful and measured. Fires burned steadily without desperation. Meals were prepared with care rather than haste. Sleep deepened. Emotional strain eased. Patience, refined through long months of cold, guided every choice. The land changed slowly and quietly. Snowbanks diminished. Ice released its grip on streams. Early flowers appeared. Birds returned. Sounds long muted by winter gradually filled the air. These changes were observed carefully, without celebration. The thaw was never taken for granted. Cold could still return. Yet the gradual return of life suggested that the most dangerous period had passed. Work continued at a steady pace. Paths were cleared, gardens prepared, fences repaired, water systems maintained. Tasks were handled with the same care required in winter, though with slightly more flexibility. Errors were easier to correct. Recovery required less effort. Life remained demanding, but it felt more manageable. Families now lived within a careful balance. Survival had been secured, but caution remained. Observation directed action. Routine evolved into steady progress. Children played and learned. Adults worked, repaired, and planned. The world beyond the cabin slowly became more welcoming, quietly and without drama. In this gradual transition from severe winter to early spring, families experienced renewal without excess. Lessons learned in the cold continued to shape behavior. Patience, consistency, awareness, and restrained optimism carried them forward. Survival was achieved not through dramatic acts, but through persistence, adaptation, and steady endurance. As snow continued to withdraw and the first reliable signs of growth appeared, families stood quietly in their cabins, watching, adjusting, and preparing. The land was waking. They were waking as well. The cold had eased. Survival had endured quietly, steadily, and without notice. In that patience, life moved forward. As spring slowly unfolded across the frontier, daily life expanded with care. The world, once limited by ice and snow, now offered new opportunities, though none arrived suddenly. Paths opened, fields softened, animals moved with ease. But every step required attention. Survival had taught a slow, deliberate way of living. Families remained cautious, knowing winter could still return if attention slipped. Children ventured farther from home, but with awareness. Mud, softened earth, and lingering ice demanded care. They learned to read the land, notice subtle changes, and move thoughtfully. Exploration increased, guided by experience. Parents watched closely, shaped by months of strict winter routines. Gardens were prepared carefully. Early crops were planted only in protected areas. New growth was monitored closely. Frost risk, soil warmth, and timing guided every decision. Even small errors could affect yields. Spring demanded patience and careful judgment. Lessons were reinforced gently through outcomes rather than hardship. Cabins continued to need attention. Thawing ground revealed minor shifts, leaks, and weakened areas. Repairs were slow and deliberate. Each small fix reflected lessons learned through endurance. Progress was measured in consistency rather than speed. Fires continued to burn, though with less intensity. Meals became lighter as fresh ingredients were added. Heavy winter foods were supplemented with early greens and roots. Familiar dishes changed subtly. These small variations offered quiet comfort. Water management remained essential. Snowmelt softened ground and altered pathways. Wells were checked. Streams were observed closely. Families remained alert, knowing spring carried its own risks. Experience and observation guided each decision just as they had throughout winter. Livestock responded to the thaw with careful expansion. Animals that had spent months near cabins now explored open pastures. Families balanced grazing needs with careful monitoring, ensuring that no animal overexerted or suffered injury. Winter's lessons on rationing and pacing were applied to all living creatures under human care. Social interactions increased. Neighbors exchanged news, labor, and resources. Visits became more frequent, though still measured. Information about weather, crop readiness, and animal behavior circulated slowly but reliably. The community, dormant through winter, reemerged with subtle coordination. Cooperation was natural, grounded in shared experience of endurance rather than necessity alone. Health continued to improve gradually. People regained strength and stamina lost over long winter months. Muscles recovered, minor injuries healed, and emotional stress diminished. Sleep was deeper, though still approached with care. Families had learned the fragility of wellness and treated recovery with deliberate attention. The transition to spring was punctuated by small, almost imperceptible markers. Longer days, the first birdsong, early blooms, and gentle warmth in sunlit areas. Families noted these signs quietly, without ceremony, using them to guide decisions about planting, travel, and work. Observation remained key. Nature was predictable only in its patterns, never in exact timing. Children's responsibilities expanded further. They assisted with planting, fed animals more independently, and helped with repair work. Lessons blended with practical application, counting seeds, measuring soil depth, noting frost risk, these tasks taught both skill and patience. Childhood now included an integration with the rhythm of life outside cabin walls. Adults focused on preparation for the full growing season. Tools were repaired, fences rebuilt, storage pits checked. Seeds stored during winter were assessed for viability. Livestock health monitored continuously. These small but steady actions laid the foundation for a productive summer. The quiet relief of spring brought emotional balance. Families were less tense, laughter returned softly, and cooperation flowed naturally. Arguments diminished. Patience, honed through months of endurance, guided interactions. People moved carefully but confidently, aware that winter's lessons had lasting value. Evenings lengthened further. Fires were tended but with less urgency. Candles burned sparingly, more for convenience than necessity. Conversations flowed calmly, often including plans for planting, repair, or travel. Children recounted small adventures outside. Adults discussed tasks and resources. Communication was steady and practical, reflecting the influence of winter's discipline. Observation remained central to life. Families watched soil moisture, plant growth, animal behavior, and weather patterns. Each day offered subtle insights that informed decisions. The slow, consistent accumulation of knowledge became a quiet source of confidence. Survival had relied on awareness. Prosperity depended on it as well. By now, the landscape itself reflected the soft power of spring. Trees budded, streams ran clear, birds returned in numbers. The thawing land offered both freedom and responsibility. Families moved more easily, but with the tempered caution of those who had endured the harshest months. The world was expanding, but the lessons of winter remained as guiding principles. In this period, life achieved a delicate equilibrium. Survival was no longer urgent, but vigilance persisted. Work, play, and observation were balanced. Health and energy returned slowly. Emotional tension eased. Routine transformed from mere endurance into measured engagement with a world that had shifted from harshness to cautious abundance. The first weeks of spring were thus both practical and symbolic. Practical because they demanded careful action and observation. Symbolic because they marked the end of a season of constraint and the gradual reassertion of possibility. Families moved gently, with deliberate steps, mindful of past hardships, but attentive to new opportunities. Quietly, steadily, life expanded outward. Children explored, adults worked, animals grazed, gardens were planted, community interaction grew. Every action reflected the influence of winter, careful pacing, observation, and persistent, patient effort. Survival had become a foundation for growth, and families moved into this new phase with cautious confidence, carrying winter's lessons softly, like a shadow stretching into longer days. As spring fully settled in, frontier families began to expand, not only physically but also in terms of daily routines. Life, which had been constrained by deep winter, started to take on a slightly broader shape. Paths became more navigable, gardens were tended with precision, livestock were moved farther from cabins. Even the smallest tasks carried a quiet significance, echoing the months of vigilance that had preceded them. Every action was informed by memory lessons learned from the long nights and the quiet monotony of surviving winter. Cabins, which had been tested relentlessly by cold, moisture, and snow, were now actively maintained, roofs repaired, walls reinforced, floors checked for damp or soft spots. Families performed these tasks deliberately, methodically. Each repair was a subtle victory, a reaffirmation that persistence had prevailed. The structures themselves stood as living reminders of endurance, proof that careful attention to small details mattered enormously. Food routines continued to shift gradually. Stored provisions from winter were still important, but they were increasingly supplemented by early garden growth and foraged plants. Meals became lighter and more varied, incorporating greens, early roots, and tender shoots. The monotony of winter stews was replaced with subtle flavors that hinted at abundance without overwhelming necessity. Children were gently introduced to the taste of new plants, learning to identify edible greens and roots through careful observation. Water management remained a quiet concern. Snowmelt sometimes created soft spots or flooded areas, requiring vigilance in travel and work. Wells and streams were monitored. Water from melting snow was still used cautiously, its warmth and clarity valued after months of scarcity. Observation of subtle environmental changes guided daily choices, preventing small problems from becoming serious setbacks. Animals responded to the warmer season with gradual, measured activity. Horses stepped confidently over softening ground. Chickens ventured farther from coops. Livestock grazed carefully in early pastures. Families balanced freedom with oversight, ensuring that no animal overexerted itself. Winter had taught the subtle art of pacing, and this principle now extended to all living creatures under human care. Social interactions increased steadily. Neighbors emerged from months of isolation. Small gatherings facilitated the exchange of tools, news, and resources. Communication about planting, water management, and livestock health became central. These interactions were practical, grounded in necessity, but they also carried quiet emotional benefits. Isolation, psychological weight lifted gradually, replaced by a measured sense of communal rhythm. Children's responsibilities expanded in parallel with the environment. They assisted in planting, caring for animals, and performing minor repairs. Practical lessons were integrated with observation of the natural world. They learned to monitor soil, watch for frost, track animal behavior, and understand the subtle cues of weather. Early spring became a season of learning through action, guided by the patient oversight of adults. Adults focused on preparation for the full growing season. Tools were repaired, fences rebuilt, seed stores checked for viability, and early crops carefully sown. Tasks were executed deliberately, emphasizing patience and accuracy over speed. Mistakes, while inevitable, were addressed with reflection and small corrective actions. The rhythm of spring demanded steady attention, a continuation of winter's discipline now applied to growth rather than survival alone. Evenings lengthened, and the household's quiet routines adapted accordingly. Fires burned steadily but without urgency. Candles were used sparingly. Conversation expanded to include plans for planting, repairs, and cautious future travel. Laughter returned subtly, woven into quiet reflections rather than boisterous display. Emotional tension from winter dissipated gradually, replaced by measured optimism and attentiveness to daily needs. Observation remained central. Families monitored soil moisture, plant growth, animal behavior, and weather patterns. Each subtle change informed decisions. Learning from nature was ongoing, and the careful accumulation of knowledge became a quiet source of confidence. The past month's lessons reinforced every choice, providing a foundation of measured certainty. By now, children's play extended further from the cabin, but remained tempered by the lingering knowledge of winter's dangers. Mud, ice patches, and uneven terrain required vigilance. Play was exploratory but cautious, blending curiosity with learned prudence. Lessons about pacing, observation, and endurance were embedded into everyday activity, quietly shaping young minds. Health improved steadily. Muscles regained flexibility after months of limited outdoor activity. Minor winter injuries healed. Appetite normalized. Sleep deepened. Emotional tension eased. Families having endured months of confinement, now operated with the calm confidence born of experience. Every movement was deliberate, every decision informed by the subtle architecture of daily life honed during winter. Work continued in steady increments. Paths were cleared fully, fences rebuilt, gardens prepared and sown, water management maintained, livestock monitored. Tasks were balanced against energy and health, avoiding overexertion. Recovery from winter's toll was gradual, careful, and sustained. The landscape itself reflected the gentle but persistent power of spring. Trees budded, streams ran freely, birds returned. The land offered both opportunity and responsibility. Families navigated it carefully, applying the lessons of winter to the challenges of thawed terrain. Observation, patience, and consistent effort guided every step. In these weeks, life achieved a delicate equilibrium. Survival was no longer urgent, but caution persisted. Work, play, observation, and preparation were balanced. Health and energy returned. Emotional tension eased. Routine became not only a necessity but a guiding principle for measured engagement with the world. Spring, fully settled, brought a subtle sense of renewal. Families moved outward, physically and emotionally, carrying winter's lessons in quiet confidence. Children explored, adults worked, animals phrased, gardens grew, community interaction expanded. Every action reflected the influence of months of endurance, a patient testament to the persistent, gentle power of adaptation. In this slow unfolding of spring, frontier families experienced relief and renewal. The harsh, long nights of winter had passed, leaving behind knowledge, resilience, and subtle confidence. Survival had been achieved through patience, observation, and quiet, consistent effort. Life continued, expanded, and adjusted, guided by the slow, steady rhythm of seasons and the enduring lessons of cold. As late spring approached, the frontier landscape was noticeably different. Snow had all but disappeared. Streams ran freely, and fields that had been frozen or muddy for months now promised growth. Yet life moved cautiously. Families had learned that sudden optimism could be punished by lingering frost or unexpected storms. The rhythm was steady, measured, and deliberate. Each day followed from the last, guided by observation, routine, and quiet confidence earned through winter's endurance. Cabins stood fully tested by the passing season. Roofs, walls, and foundations had been repaired, reinforced, and adjusted where winter had caused damage. Each creaking board and every sealed gap served as a reminder of endurance and the value of regular care. Families worked slowly and attentively, understanding that small corrections prevented larger problems later. Life inside the cabin felt familiar again, though familiarity now carried the quiet weight of experience. Food routines continued to shift. Winter stores were nearly exhausted, making space for early harvests and carefully gathered wild plants. Meals included tender greens, early roots, and fresh herbs, offering relief from months of repetition. Families ate with calm appreciation, valuing nourishment and variety equally. Children learned to identify edible plants with care, combining observation with practical survival knowledge. Water remained a daily priority. Streams, springs, and wells were monitored for clarity and consistency. Snowmelt occasionally caused flooding, creating minor hazards that required adjustment. Families moved with care, balancing caution with the increasing ease of thawed ground. Water management had become habitual, shaped by months of necessity. Animals responded well to warmer conditions. Chickens ranged farther from their coops. Horses and cattle grazed more freely, though still observed for signs of strain or injury. Lessons from winter about rationing and pacing remained relevant. Livestock care was deliberate, balancing growth, health, and long-term sustainability. Watching animal behavior remained an essential routine. Community life expanded steadily. Neighbors met more often, sharing labor, tools, and information. Conversations centered on planting schedules, repairs, and early seasonal concerns. Brief visits offered quiet, emotional relief after isolation. Cooperation strengthened connections, reinforcing that while winter demanded independence, spring allowed careful cooperation. Children explored more widely, cleared paths, and softened ground opened new areas for movement and learning. Responsibilities included helping with planting, caring for animals, and assisting with repairs. Observation, patience, and attentiveness shaped daily tasks. Winter's lessons now guided activity in a broader, more active environment. Adults focused on preparing for the full growing season. Gardens were planted methodically, tools were repaired, fences reinforced, and storage areas inspected. Livestock health was checked regularly. Work remained careful and intentional, shaped by habits developed during winter. Errors were corrected without haste, reinforcing steady discipline. Evenings were quiet and controlled. Fires burned steadily without urgency. Candles were used with restraint. Conversation moved slowly, touching on planting, repairs, and cautious plans for travel. Gentle laughter returned, subtle and unforced. Emotional strain eased gradually, replaced by calm attention to daily needs. Observation continued to guide every action. Soil conditions, plant growth, water movement, animal behavior, and weather patterns were noted carefully. Each change informed decisions. Knowledge gained during winter remained essential. Awareness reduced risk and built confidence. Survival had depended on attention, and spring required the same. Health improved consistently. Muscles regained flexibility. Small injuries healed. Appetite stabilized. Sleep deepened. Families, having endured long confinement and limited resources, now moved with measured confidence. Decisions were thoughtful, actions deliberate, and emotional strength reinforced by patient endurance. Work progressed in steady stages. Paths stayed clear. Fences were maintained. Gardens were tended. Livestock were observed daily. Effort was balanced carefully against energy and resources. Recovery from winter remained gradual and ongoing. Daily life blended labor, observation, and quiet reflection. The land reflected late spring's gentle strength. Trees filled with buds, streams flowed freely, birds returned in number, opportunity expanded, but caution remained necessary. Families moved through the landscape, guided by winter's lessons, applying patience, awareness, and steady effort to every task. During these weeks, life settled into a careful balance. Survival was no longer urgent, yet attentiveness remained. Work, rest, play, and observation found their place. Health strengthened. Emotional strain eased. Routine became a steady structure for engaging with a world that had shifted from confinement to measured abundance. Families carried a quiet assurance. Children ranged farther, guided by awareness rather than restraint. Adults worked with consistency, applying lessons learned during winter to the demands of spring. Animals grazed securely, gardens developed, and community ties deepened. Each decision reflected knowledge gained through long months of careful persistence. In the gradual unfolding of late spring, Renewal arrived without spectacle. The severe nights had passed, leaving resilience, experience, and calm confidence. Life expanded and adapted, guided by patience, observation, and steady effort. Survival had been achieved through continuity rather than drama, shaped by families who understood seasonal rhythms, preparation, and the lasting instruction of winter. As early summer approached, the frontier shifted again. Spring's cautious expansion gave way to a more confident engagement with the land. Warmer temperatures and longer days made movement easier. Care remained, but winter's limits had faded. Confidence grew quietly as familiar routines now supported work, play, and planning in gentler conditions. Cabins, tested by cold and restored in spring, became secure centers rather than protective refuges. Roofs, walls, and foundations stood firm. Minor flaws were addressed promptly. Maintenance remained constant, reflecting the understanding that neglect could undo careful effort. Each repair represented sustained attention and responsibility. Food routines mirrored the season's growth. Early garden harvests were joined by berries, wild herbs, and young vegetables. Meals were lighter and fresher, yet guided by restraint. New flavors were introduced gradually, balancing enjoyment with preservation. Children learned plant identification, combining practical knowledge with careful observation refined during winter. Water management continued with steady focus. Streams ran freely, wells remained full, and rainwater was collected when possible. Soil moisture, fields, and pastures were observed closely. Planting, irrigation, and livestock care followed environmental cues. Awareness of conditions remained central to daily decisions. Animals flourished in the early warmth. Horses, cattle, goats, and chickens moved easily across pastures, still guided by attentive oversight. Feeding, grazing, and movement followed the steady pace established during colder months. Careful observation ensured health and productivity. Livestock remained essential, providing both labor and sustenance managed with accumulated experience. Children's responsibilities grew. They helped with planting, gathered early greens, assisted with animal care, and handled small repairs. Learning continued through participation, blending responsibility with patience. The environment was more open and active, yet winter's lessons shaped movement and awareness. Exploration remained thoughtful and grounded. Adults prepared for the height of the growing season. Fields were planted, gardens maintained, fences reinforced, and tools kept ready. Livestock health, water supply, and crop protection were monitored closely. Work followed a steady rhythm, balanced against weather, energy, and observation. Errors were addressed calmly, reinforcing habits formed through endurance. Evenings lengthened and remained calm. Fires were used for comfort rather than survival. Candles extended light when needed. Conversation flowed easily, touching on planning, reflection, and quiet stories. Gentle laughter returned, restrained but genuine, marking emotional release after months of vigilance and restraint. Observation remained central to life. Families noted changes in soil, water, plant growth, and animal behavior. Subtle cues guided planting, grazing, and labor decisions. The accumulation of knowledge over months of winter and spring provided confidence, allowing action to be deliberate, efficient, and safe. Awareness was the quiet backbone of life. Health continued to improve. Muscles strengthened with more physical activity. Appetite stabilized and expanded. Sleep deepened. Emotional tension, once heightened by isolation and cold, eased further. Families operated with calm confidence, supported by experience and routine. The rhythm of daily life allowed slow, steady restoration of both body and mind. Work continued in measured increments. Paths were cleared, fences maintained, gardens tended, and livestock managed. Tasks were balanced carefully, ensuring no overexertion and preserving energy for unpredictable challenges. Daily life became a rhythm of labor, observation, and quiet reflection, guided by lessons from past seasons. The landscape reflected the subtle power of early summer. Trees fully leafed, streams ran clear, birds filled the air, and fields showed signs of growth. Families moved through this environment with awareness, balancing opportunity with caution. Nature offered abundance, but demanded attention, observation, and steady effort. In late mornings and afternoons, children played and explored, still under the watchful eye of adults. Learning through movement, observation, and responsibility continued. Tasks and chores were intertwined with curiosity, offering both education and engagement with the environment. The subtle skills honed during winter and spring patience, awareness, and endurance remained relevant in this warmer, more forgiving season. Social interaction increased further. Neighbors exchanged labor, tools, and knowledge. Cooperative projects became more common as families worked together to repair fences, prepare fields, and manage shared resources. These interactions were practical but carried emotional benefits, easing isolation and fostering a quiet sense of community resilience. Even as early summer progressed, vigilance persisted. Families maintained careful routines, continued observation of weather, soil, and animal behavior, and reinforced structures to prevent damage. The lessons of winter remained embedded in daily life, shaping decisions, pacing labor, and guiding planning. Survival had shifted to sustainable engagement, but its principles endured. By now, life operated in a quiet momentum. Children explored and learned. Adults worked steadily, and animals thrived. Daily routines balanced labor, observation, and reflection. Community interaction, though cautious, increased. Health and energy returned fully. Families moved with the calm confidence born of enduring long winter nights and navigating the gradual shifts of spring. In this slow unfolding of early summer, frontier families experienced subtle triumph. The long winter had passed. Spring had taught patience, caution, and observation. Early summer offered warmth, growth, and opportunity. Life expanded, adjusted, and continued with deliberate, steady persistence, guided by the enduring lessons of survival, routine, and quiet attention to the rhythms of the land. As the summer days stretched longer and the air grew heavier with warmth, frontier families entered the new phase of rhythm, the quiet harvest. This wasn't the frenetic, rushed event one might imagine. There were no grand celebrations, no sudden bursts of energy. No, the harvest was a process gradual, steady, and shaped by months of observation, patience, and planning. The land, which had once been buried under snow and ice, was now fertile with promise. Yet families moved cautiously, aware that every crop harvested, every plant pulled from the soil, was part of a larger, slow cycle that had begun in winter. The gardens had yielded their early crops: potatoes, beans, peas, carrots. Children helped with the gathering, bending down to pull weeds, carefully uproot vegetables, and collect herbs. There was no rush to fill baskets with bounty, just a steady accumulation, a quiet celebration of patience. The earth, which had been harsh and unforgiving in winter, now returned the favor with its gifts, and the family responded in kind by collecting what had been grown with steady hands and careful observation. Adults continued their work, focused on the broader task of preparing for the coming months. The harvest was only one part of the process. Food preservation was central to their survival. Canning, salting, drying, and storing were done with quiet precision. There was little fanfare to this work. It wasn't glamorous. It was simply the next logical step in a process that began when the frost settled in months earlier. The jars of preserved vegetables lined shelves, the drying racks filled with herbs and meats. Every corner of the cabin now echoed with the quiet, rhythmic task of preparing for winter because the cycle of survival was never truly over. It was always about anticipation, always about the next season. Animals were closely monitored as well. Livestock was fattened in the pastures, eggs were collected regularly, milk from cows and goats was turned into cheese or butter. The rhythm of feeding, watching, and tending was a never ending cycle. No task was too small. Every action mattered. Families learned to work together, gradually integrating the rhythm of animal care with the rhythm of daily chores. It wasn't always easy. Animals, like people, had moods, and some days the livestock didn't cooperate. But the routine was consistent, and consistency was survival's true backbone. Work expanded to maintaining the structure of the cabins. There was always something to repair, a shingle to replace, a wall to patch. The foundations were tested by the summer rains. The roof had to be checked again to ensure it didn't leak when the thunderclouds rolled in. These tasks were never urgent. They were simply part of the ongoing effort: maintenance, observation, improvement. It was a slow process that demanded attention, but it never ceased. Evenings, once lit only by the flicker of candles during long, cold winter nights, were now illuminated by the gentler glow of firelight. The days were still long, but as the sun began to sink below the horizon, families gathered inside the cabin. Conversation was quiet and easy. The hard work of the day was done. Small moments of laughter filled the air. Children recounted their daily explorations. Adults discussed the plans for tomorrow. The sense of tension from the long winter months had dissipated almost entirely. There was a quiet peace now, but it wasn't the peace of complacency. It was the peace of knowing that survival had been secured, that the work had been done, and that the next season was already in the mind. Occasionally, neighbors would stop by. The work of the harvest season was something shared. Fences were repaired together, animals were traded, tools were exchanged. There was no great rush to these interactions. It was simply the way things were done. A quiet exchange of labor, information, and trust. Social interaction was still meaningful, but it had the comfortable quality of familiarity. No one was rushing to catch up after months of isolation. There was no need. The frontier community had its own rhythm, its own pace, and that pace was built on small, steady interactions. The nights, now cool but not cold, were spent preparing for the next day's work. Families gathered around the fire, patching clothes, mending tools, and making small repairs to things that had broken or frayed during the day's tasks. There was no grand gesture to this work. It was just the quiet, necessary task of maintaining what had been built. There were no fireworks. There was no drama, just steady, constant labor to ensure the smooth continuation of life. As the month moved on, the bounty of the harvest continued to be gathered, preserved, and stored. The barns began to fill with grains, vegetables, and dried meats. The fruits of the labor were stacked in quiet piles. The work was its own reward, not in the flashy sense, but in the deep, unspoken satisfaction of knowing that another year of survival had been secured, that the family had once again passed through the cycle of winter, spring, and summer, and were now looking ahead to the next. Throughout it all, families continued their quiet, measured routines. There were no great highs or lows. There was no flash of excitement or dramatic change. The work of the frontier was always slow, methodical, and constant. The land required respect and attention, not heroics. It required observation and patience, not hastiness. And so, day by day, night by night, families moved through the harvest season with the quiet confidence of those who knew what was coming and knew how to prepare for it. And so, as summer progressed gently toward its end, the quiet momentum of daily life carried on. The long days gave way to shorter evenings, and with them came the slow realization that soon the cycle would begin again. There would be more repairs, more preparations. There would be more harvests, more preservation. There would be more work. But there would also be rest, moments of peace, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that everything had been done slowly, done steadily, done well. The frontier was not a place for extremes, it was a place for endurance. And in the endurance, the family had built something lasting, something strong, something quiet. As the heat of summer began to wane and the night slowly drew in, families on the frontier felt the shift in the air, the subtle, inevitable descent of autumn. The golden haze of summer lingered in the afternoons, but the coolness that arrived at dusk was a constant reminder that the balance of the seasons was about to tip again. With the changing of the leaves came another quiet, steady rhythm preparation for the impending cold. The slow descent into autumn wasn't a shock, it was a soft but certain reminder of winter's return. The work continued, but now there was an added layer of urgency. Children, still busy with their various chores, had become accustomed to the slower pace of summer, yet they too could feel the pressure of the season's change. The mornings grew chillier, the evenings darker. The crispness in the air seemed to draw them closer to the warmth of the cabin, but also to a deeper awareness of the work left to do. Gardens that had been vibrant with the bounty of summer now began to show signs of the coming frost. The rush to gather the last crops was quieter than one might expect. No one hurried, no one panicked. Each vegetable was gathered with careful hands, stored in cool, dry places, ready to be preserved. Every step was deliberate, another lesson in the art of knowing when to act and when to wait. For adults, the shift to autumn meant a quiet urgency. There were preparations to be made, more preserves, more repairs, more work on the cabins and fences before the first snow could catch them unprepared. It wasn't a panic that gripped them. It was a calm recognition of the work still ahead. Everything that had been built, planted, and nurtured over the warmer months now needed to be safeguarded, fortified for the inevitable return of winter. The animals were given extra care in these weeks. Fields were checked for any signs of frost, and livestock were moved carefully to the last grazing areas. The change in the air affected them too. Horses and cattle were brought in from open pastures into barns or sheltered enclosures. Chickens, goats, and pigs were fed more carefully, ensuring that they gained as much weight as possible before the cold months arrived. Every small detail mattered. The lessons of the previous seasons played out in this final push. Observation was key, and those who knew their animals knew the subtle differences in their behavior, made the smallest adjustments before the cold set in. The cabins, too, were the focus of constant attention. Every crack, every joint, every window was checked for leaks. The insulation of walls, the stability of roofs, the safety of chimneys, nothing could be overlooked. It was a season for repairs, for the last few tweaks before the harsh winds would test the integrity of the shelter. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. There was no room for negligence. Yet, despite the tangible urgency, life didn't turn chaotic. It was still methodical, patient, steady. There was no rush, no frantic flurry of activity. People worked together, focused on the tasks that had to be completed without distraction or waste. Even as the temperatures dropped, the calm of the work continued. Neighbors, still trusted and familiar, offered quiet help. One family might lend another a hand with last minute repairs or share surplus goods from the garden. These small gestures of cooperation were not born out of desperation, but out of mutual respect and shared experience. Everyone understood the work needed to be done. No one complained. It was simply a matter of getting it done together. Evenings, now darker earlier, had taken on a different tone. The fire in the hearth burned more steadily. The cabin was more often filled with the warm glow of firelight than sunlight. The scent of cooking food mixed with the dry, earthy smell of harvested crops. Candles flickered softly, providing just enough light to weave through small tasks, mending, knitting, repairing tools. The slow work continued, each motion a quiet reflection of months of learning. The family unit had become stronger, its rhythm smoother. Yet, beneath the calm exterior of routine, a quiet awareness persisted. Winter was coming, and while everyone was prepared in the most practical sense, there was an underlying vigilance. The knowledge that the storm could arrive unexpectedly, that the cold could cut deeper than anticipated, that the land had its own mood and could not be fully controlled, kept families sharp. But again, there was no panic, there was no tension in the air, just the patient acceptance of what was to come. As autumn deepened, the landscape began to change in small ways. Trees shed their leaves, revealing their bare, skeletal forms. The ground, once soft and yielding, began to harden. Patches of frost appeared on the early mornings, signaling that the first real freeze could be just around the corner. The sky, once a bright, expansive blue, now deepened into a muted gray, hinting at the coming storms. Families noticed, of course, they always noticed. But these changes weren't sudden or shocking. They were simply part of the steady rhythm of life. In the cabin, people carried on with quiet confidence. Meals became heartier soups, stews, slow cooked meats, comforting and filling. With the change in seasons came a shift in diet. The abundance of fresh vegetables, still present but waning, was slowly replaced by the preserved foods that had been carefully stocked away. The pantry, once filled with summer's harvest, now began to reflect the steady, reliable preservation work done through the past months. Yet, amid all the work and preparation, there were moments of quiet contentment. Even as the temperatures continued to drop and the shadows lengthened, families would sit together in the warmth of their cabins, recounting the day's labor. Small moments of joy, of laughter, of shared stories filled the space. There were no dramatic outbursts, no wild celebrations, just the steady comfort of knowing that the work had been done well, that the family was prepared, and that the world outside, while changing, would always move in cycles. As autumn's full weight settled in, families found themselves increasingly in sync with the rhythm of the land. They had come to understand it deeply, not through grand knowledge or theory, but through quiet, constant engagement. Every task performed, every choice made, reflected the intimate relationship forged with the environment. And now, as the final preparations were made and the last few crops harvested, there was a sense of deep satisfaction because survival wasn't just about getting through the winter. It was about learning to live with it, to respect it, and to work with it as calmly and steadily as the seasons themselves moved through the years. Winter would come, but it was already known. It was already part of the rhythm. And that, in itself, was a kind of peace, a quiet certainty that no matter how cold, how dark, or how long the nights would be, the steady, measured work would carry them through. And so winter arrived, It didn't come with a dramatic blast of wind or a sudden drop in temperature. No, instead, it slid in gently, almost imperceptibly, as though it had always been there, waiting. By now, families on the frontier had learned to welcome it, not with excitement, but with a deep, settled acceptance. It was a part of the cycle, after all. The bitter cold, the dark nights, the quiet isolation, these were no longer things to fear or dread. They were simply what came after autumn. Cabins, now well maintained, stood as sturdy, trusted shelters against the elements. The roofs, reinforced against snow and ice, remained solid and dependable. The walls, insulated by years of experience and the labor of previous seasons, kept the chill out. The fires, always stoked carefully, flickered warmly in the hearths. There was no panic. There was no rush. Winter was just another part of the rhythm, another phase to move through with calm patience. The work didn't stop, of course. There was always something to do. The winter months demanded that families remain active in quiet ways. Chores were adjusted to fit the season's limitations. Snow had to be shoveled, pathways cleared, wood chopped, and stored. Every family member had their role tasks that were familiar, steady, and reflective of the long history of adaptation that had been passed down. Even children, now more capable after a year of learning, had their contributions to make. They knew their tasks well. The work in winter was different, though. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't a mad dash to prepare for something. It was a simple continuation of the steady rhythm established long before the first frost. Repairs were done, yes, but mostly maintenance, ensuring that the woodpile was sufficient, the roof was sound, the chimney clear of soot, the firewood was stacked high. These were things that were quietly anticipated, things that were always done, but never with urgency. The days were shorter, of course, and the darkness seemed to stretch forever, but in the cabin, the time was filled with small tasks: mending clothes, stitching quilts, knitting, writing letters, reading by candlelight. There was no rush, no pressing need to be anywhere or do anything. The slow rhythm of winter demanded patience. Time moved differently. The cold outside was relentless, but inside there was comfort in the stillness. Meals were heartier now. The work of preserving had paid off. Canned vegetables, dried meats, and salted fish were turned into rich stews and soups. Bread was baked with care, its warm smell filling the cabin. There was no need to rush meals either. They were savored slowly, each bite a reminder of the effort that had gone into stocking the larder. The slow simmering of a stew over the fire was as much a part of winter as the cold itself. Evenings were long. The fire crackled. The light dimmed in the corners of the room. Conversations drifted into comfortable silences, punctuated by the occasional crack of the wood in the stove. Stories were told of past winters, of hardships overcome, of survival. The children, now older and more accustomed to the cadence of frontier life, gathered close to hear tales of the past. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in on them as they huddled together, the weight of winter outside pressing against the window panes. But there was warmth inside. There was familiarity. There was a quiet peace that came from knowing exactly what was expected and what was to come. The snow began to fall more often, sometimes in heavy sheets that blanketed the world in white. The sight of it, from the warmth of the cabin, was almost serene. It was as if the snow itself was a reminder of the slow, consistent rhythm of life. The world outside was muted under its weight. It made everything feel softer, slower, more deliberate. Neighbors, though distant in winter, still checked on each other when necessary. The isolation of the season was deep, but not harsh. It was understood. No one rushed to visit for the sake of idle chatter. The communication was meaningful, shared resources, small acts of kindness. the passing of tools or information about the weather. There were no bustling gatherings. The cold kept everyone home. But it was an isolation that felt natural, even necessary. The animals, too, adapted to the season. Some were housed in barns and enclosures, safe from the worst of the cold. The dogs, loyal companions, curled by the fire with the family. Chickens huddled in their coops. Horses and cattle were fed well, their shelters protected from snowdrifts. Life for the livestock slowed, but it didn't stop. It continued quietly as it always did. Winter was a time for small triumphs. Every log brought inside, every chimney cleaned, every window caulked, every crack sealed, every stitch mended, all of it mattered. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply survival. And survival, when done well, felt like a quiet, comforting victory. There was no showiness to it. It was humble. It was steady. It was, in many ways, the essence of frontier life, quiet, patient, and enduring. The end of winter would come eventually, but for now it remained. And in its stillness, in its isolation, in its coldness, there was peace. It wasn't the peace of escape or adventure. It wasn't the peace of excitement or change. It was the peace of knowing exactly what was required, exactly what was expected, and exactly what had been accomplished. Winter, in all its darkness, offered a quiet kind of satisfaction that could only come from survival itself. And so the days passed, slowly, quietly. There was no rush, there were no surprises. It was the slow, steady rhythm of life lived in tune with the land, the seasons, and the quiet, enduring work that made survival not a struggle, but a simple, steady fact of existence. As the weeks in winter wore on, the days, though long and dark, carried with them a subtle shift. It wasn't a drastic change, no thunderclap of awakening or dramatic break from the monotony of the cold, but rather a faint sense that things were moving forward, just out of sight. Perhaps it was the way the snow began to feel just a little less heavy, how the darkness started to lift by an imperceptible amount each day. It was a gradual thing, something that could be felt rather than seen, like the faintest trace of warmth on a stone wall after a long, bitter night. But even in the quiet dead of winter, there was something that hinted at the slow return of spring. It wasn't the landscape that told the story. No, the snow and ice still clung to the earth, stubbornly refusing to let go, but it was the shift in the air itself, a change that could only be felt when one had lived through the same seasons, the same rhythms, time and time again. It was the softest whisper of something new coming, a return to life, the promise of more work, more growth, and more observation. For the families living in their isolated cabins, that whisper became a silent conversation between them and the land. They knew that the cold wasn't eternal. It was just another phase, and soon enough the earth would thaw, the sun would rise earlier, and the frozen streams would begin to run again. The early days of winter had been long, drawn out, and filled with labor, but now the isolation was beginning to feel less like confinement and more like a necessary part of the cycle. There was work to be done, of course, there always was. But as the deep winter continued, there was a quiet sense of waiting, waiting for the first thaw, the first real sign that the days would stretch long again, that the world would warm, and the promise of new life would begin to emerge from the cold earth. The work of winter wasn't glamorous, nor was it particularly exciting, but it had a kind of timelessness to it, a rhythm that settled into the bones and became part of a family's heartbeat. The cabins, insulated and sturdy, stood as silent guardians of that rhythm. The work inside continued, steady and without haste. People moved slowly, carefully, still keeping the rhythm of daily tasks, feeding the fire, mending clothing, checking supplies, ensuring that everything was in its place. Every action was done with purpose, done with the knowledge that no matter how cold it got outside, no matter how much the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, the cabin would remain a safe haven. It wasn't something that could be taken for granted, after all. Everything had been built, maintained, and strengthened with time, patience, and the quiet knowledge that survival required constant, consistent attention. The animals, too, lived by the slow rhythm of the season. The ones kept inside, dogs, rabbits, chickens, adjusted to the dim light and cold air. They, too, had their routines, though their instincts knew to slow, to conserve energy, to wait for warmer days. The horses and cattle were fed carefully, watched over for signs of frostbite or sickness. The livestock were part of a delicate balance, too little care, and they could weaken in the cold, too much activity, and they could burn out before the new season arrived. It was a delicate art, the careful maintenance of both animal and human life through the harshest season of the year. But even as the deep cold gripped the land, families remained in their own unhurried flow. Time passed in measured increments, one task blending into the next, one day merging seamlessly into another. There was no rush to it. It wasn't a time for grand achievements or high drama. There were no breakthroughs, no thrilling moments of success, just the steady, quiet assurance that the work had been done, that winter was being survived, and that in time it would end, just like it always had. The deep silence of winter also offered space for reflection. Inside the cabin, families sat together in front of the fire, listening to the crackling wood, watching the flames flicker in the hearth. It wasn't an active time, this midwinter stretch, but it was a time of quiet observation. The world outside, covered in a blanket of white, was still and mute. But inside, there was a conversation, an unspoken exchange between the family and the land, between what had been done and what was yet to come. It was the perfect time for stories. Adults told tales of past winters, of moments of hardship overcome, or small victories won in the face of harsh conditions. Children, their minds still growing and shaping themselves around the cycles of life, listened eagerly, their imaginations caught between the stories of the past and their quiet, unfolding future. The steady pace of winter meant that every story, every moment shared, felt more significant. Time slowed down in the long evenings, and in that stillness there was room for both reflection and anticipation. And then the tiniest of signs began to emerge. It wasn't obvious at first, the shift in the birds' songs, the slow melting of snow from the roof, the faintest hint of a warmer breeze on the still cold air. But for those who had lived through enough cycles of the seasons, those subtle changes were enough. The land was waking up again. Spring, though far away still, was beginning to be just a little closer. The wait would soon be over. Winter, as hard as it was simply the prelude to something else, something to be respected and learned from, but never feared. The rhythms of life on the frontier were always leading somewhere, always preparing for what came next. And now, with the first hints of spring's return, there was a quiet but undeniable sense that the cycle was starting once more. The land, the animals, the people, everything was in motion, waiting for the inevitable change that would come with the first thaw. The work, the patience, the quiet endurance of winter had been a test, a measure of how far families could push themselves, how well they could prepare. But now, as the days began to stretch just a little longer, as the first tentative warmth began to creep in, there was a calm confidence that the land would soon give way to new growth. It wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be sudden. It would be slow and steady. Just like everything else, spring was on its way. The cycle would begin again. But for now, families on the frontier continued to live with the quiet understanding that all things were temporary, even winter. They simply had to wait just a little longer to see what would come next. By now, winter's grip had loosened, not with a sudden rush, but with a slow, almost imperceptible retreat. The nights were still cold, but the days began to stretch just a little longer, and with that extra sunlight, something in the land seemed to stir. It wasn't the rush of buds bursting open or the frantic return of wildlife. No, it was more subtle. The earth, still frozen in patches, had started to warm. The snow, which had once fallen thick and heavy, began to melt slowly, revealing the brown and gray remnants of a landscape that had endured months of cold. For those who had survived the harsh months of winter, this was the beginning of something important, the promise of renewal, but also the promise of more work. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, the kind that comes with the first hint of something new. The cabin felt warmer not just because of the fire, but because the sunlight, now stronger and more persistent, seemed to penetrate through the cracks in the wood, casting a soft glow over the room. The children noticed it first. They were outside more often now, with less concern about the harshness of winter. They explored the snow-melted paths, their breath still visible in the chilly air, but their energy returning, as if they, too, could sense the shift. The world was waking up, and so were they. The work continued as it always did. The cabin was inspected again, just in case the mildness of the weather might bring some unexpected challenges. The roof was checked for leaks, the firewood was counted, and the windows were carefully cleaned to let in as much light as possible. There was no sudden frenzy, no last-minute rush. It was just a quiet awareness that the new season was on its way, and with it, new responsibilities. Spring's arrival wasn't marked by loud celebrations or dramatic changes. It was more like a soft exhale, a sigh of relief. The harshness of winter had been endured, and now the land and the people living on it were ready for something different. Families adjusted their routines accordingly. The pace of life picked up ever so slightly as the first signs of new life began to show themselves. The chickens, now no longer confined to their coops, began to roam a little farther, pecking at the thawing ground, looking for the early shoots of green. The cattle and horses were allowed to graze in areas where the snow had melted, their coats thick with the winter's protection now beginning to shed in preparation for warmer days. The children, still exploring the newly revealed earth, began to help their parents prepare for planting season. Seeds were checked, stored in their cool, dry places, ready for the earth to warm enough to accept them. The slow, steady work of the coming season began to reveal itself. Gardens needed to be planned, tools sharpened, paths cleared, but all of this was done with the same careful attention that had seen them through the previous months. There was no rush, no panic, just a steady, quiet confidence that they knew exactly what to do and how to do it. The landscape, too, began to reveal its subtle changes. The small streams, which had been frozen solid for so long, were now slowly, surely running again, their waters swollen with the remnants of snowmelt. The early buds of trees, not yet full, began to show a hint of green, like the first whispers of spring's promises. The soil, still cold and damp, would soon be ready for planting, but it wasn't quite time yet. The families knew this. They had learned to listen to the land, to watch for the small cues that told them when it was right to act. Patience remained their constant companion, and so they waited. They continued their work, maintaining the quiet, steady rhythm that had carried them through the seasons. The fire burned steadily, but without urgency. The cabin was still a place of comfort and refuge, but now it also became a place of preparation. It was the quiet anticipation of what was to come that marked this transition. There was no dramatic shift, no overwhelming sense of change, just the soft certainty that the next cycle had begun. With each passing day, the days grew just a little longer, and the chill in the air grew just a little softer. The warmth was coming. The promise of spring, though gradual, was undeniable. The earth was waking up, but it would do so on its own time, just as it always had. And the families on the frontier, having lived through the challenges of winter, would be ready. They had learned the rhythm of survival. They had learned patience, attentiveness, and the value of steady, consistent work. And now, as the world slowly thawed, they would put all that knowledge to use once more. Spring, when it arrived fully, wouldn't be a grand event. It wouldn't be loud or sudden. It would simply be another part of the quiet, cyclical dance that had been going on long before them and would continue long after. But for now, that was enough. The land was waking up, and so were they. And as the first faint warmth of spring began to seep into the air, there was nothing to do but accept it, move with it, and continue to live by the steady rhythm they had come to know so well. And so they carried on. As the last remnants of snow melted away, the land revealed itself in quiet stages, its greening a slow, deliberate process. The trees, still bare, began to show the first hint of buds, their branches stretching toward the sky as if waking from a long, deep sleep. The earth, which had been hard and cold, now softened, its surface cracked in places, hinting at the growth beneath. And still, the rhythm of life continued in its steady, unhurried way. The families on the frontier, ever attentive, moved in tune with the land, responding to its quiet changes with the same care and patience that had carried them through every season before. There was no hurry, no sense of urgency. The work needed to be done. Of course, there were tools to be sharpened, fences to be repaired, the soil to be worked, but the pace remained the same. The days were longer now, but they didn't stretch into frantic activity. Instead, they unfolded gently, like the soft opening of a flower. The work was important, yes, but it was done slowly, methodically, without rushing. The first flowers of spring began to appear, delicate and small, their colors popping against the brown earth. The children, still a bit restless from the confines of winter, found joy in these small signs of life. They would gather flowers, chase the insects that had begun to reappear, and sit in the sun's warmth when it was strong enough. But their play was still tethered to the steady flow of daily chores. They helped with small tasks, learning the skills that would keep the family going: mending, stitching, washing, and organizing. It was a slow education, but it was steady, and it fit the rhythm of their world. The adults, too, began to settle into the more active season. The early crops were planted: carrots, potatoes, and beans. The gardens, still in their infancy, would need constant care. Weeds had to be pulled, rows kept straight, and the soil worked carefully to ensure that the crops would grow strong. There was no frantic rush to plant everything at once. Instead, it was done methodically, in the knowledge that the season would be long enough. Spring, though brief, was a season for patience and observation. The earth had to be worked, but with care, with an eye on the sky, watching for the late frosts that could kill tender shoots. Animals, too, were adjusted to the changing season. The cows and goats were led out to graze on the new grass, their bodies still thick from winter but beginning to shed their winter coats. The chickens were freer now, scratching in the dirt, pecking at the early weeds. The horses, still heavy with the coat of winter, were given more attention, their coats brushed, their bodies checked for any lingering effects of the cold. It was a time of observation, of watching for any signs of sickness or distress, as the animals adjusted to the change in weather. The cabin itself, though sturdy, was still subject to the rhythms of the changing seasons. There were repairs to be made, small adjustments to the roof or the walls, cracks to be filled, gaps to be sealed. The fire was less needed now during the day, but it still burned in the evening, providing warmth and light as the days continued to stretch longer. The smell of fresh bread or soup lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of the land outside, now waking up in its own quiet way. Evenings remained a time for togetherness, a time when the work of the day was done and the family could gather, slow and steady, around the fire. There were no grand speeches, no wild celebrations, just the quiet comfort of being together, of knowing that the day had been spent well. The children, tired from their work and play, sat close, listening to stories from the adults, tales of other seasons, of past hardships, of things to come. The days moved on, one after another, and the steady rhythm of life continued. There were no sudden bursts of excitement or dramatic shifts in the air. The work was consistent, the days slowly longer, the earth more alive with each passing hour. The first fruits of labor were still weeks away, but that didn't matter. The work would continue, the land would continue to grow, and life would continue its steady march toward summer. There was no rush, no need for haste. The rhythms of the frontier were gentle and unhurried, and in that steadiness there was peace. The land, ever patient, had no need for hurry. It was not bound by the clock, nor by the demands of the world outside. It moved in its own time, and those who lived on it had learned to move with it. The first stirrings of summer were still distant, but they were there, on the horizon, faint but undeniable. And when summer arrived, as it inevitably would, it would come not with a grand flourish, but with the same quiet, steady pace that had marked every season before. And when it came, the family would be ready, ready to continue the cycle, ready to move with the land, ready for the next part of the journey. The steady rhythm of life, ever moving, ever changing, would carry them into the warm days ahead and beyond. But for now, there was still the work of spring to be done. There was still time to watch, to wait, to prepare. And in that quiet work, there was a deep, quiet satisfaction, a satisfaction in knowing that no matter what came next, they had the patience and the resolve to meet it head on, just as they always had. As the days stretched longer and the first hints of summer teased the horizon, the pace of life shifted imperceptibly. No longer was there the quiet anticipation of spring's arrival. The air now carried a promise, a reminder that the long summer days would soon be upon them. The children, still restless but now accustomed to the rhythm of outdoor work, spent their days in the warmth, helping with small tasks, or stealing moments of freedom to chase one another through the grass. The landscape, still bearing the scars of winter, was now awash in the vibrant green of new growth, the earth pulsating with life. But it was a quiet life, a life that had learned to move in tune with the land, where the sense of urgency remained as distant as the summer thunderstorms that had yet to arrive. The work, though lighter now, with the rising temperatures, continued as it always had, steady, without rush. The gardens that had been planted slowly and deliberately were beginning to show signs of life. Tiny green shoots pushed up from the earth, fragile and delicate, but unmistakably present. The rows of crops, though small, were growing. There was no immediate need for celebration, no big fanfare. It was simply another phase of the ongoing cycle, just another step along the way. The crops would grow if they were cared for well, and they would be harvested in their own time. But even now, there was no frantic energy, just the quiet, knowing that the season was unfolding as it should. The days themselves felt heavier in a way, laden with the kind of work that came with the full heat of summer's promise. Now, it was about maintenance. The fences needed to be checked more frequently as the livestock began to roam farther. The barns needed to be inspected to ensure that there was enough room for the animals that would soon need shelter from the full heat of the sun. There were repairs to be made, small tasks that were mundane but necessary, all quietly checked off, one by one. Every day was another step toward the inevitable heat that would soon arrive, but there was no sense of stress about it, no need for alarm. Everything was part of the rhythm. The animals, too, adjusted to the change. The horses, once thick with winter coats, began shedding their fur, their bodies growing leaner and more nimble in the heat. The cows and goats, now accustomed to the warmer weather, grazed on the lush grasses that had sprung up, their bodies fattening slowly. The chickens, free to roam as they pleased, clucked and scratched at the earth, searching for any insects they could find. Even the smallest creatures seemed to take their time, moving in slow, deliberate motions, as though they, too, understood the importance of this moment before the true weight of summer arrived. Inside the cabin, the days were spent preparing for what was to come. The work of preserving began to take shape. The early fruits and vegetables from the garden were carefully harvested and stored away. Canning jars were cleaned, the edges of lids were checked for wear, and the stockpiles of dried herbs and meats were carefully sorted. It was a quiet, measured process, nothing too dramatic, just the necessary work that would ensure survival through the lean months that would eventually come. The satisfaction of this work wasn't immediate. It was a future satisfaction, the knowledge that what was being done now would ensure the family had enough to eat when the world outside was locked in the grip of winter again. Evenings were long now, and the fire that had been a constant companion in the colder months was less necessary, but it still burned softly in the evenings, a quiet glow in the corner of the room. Meals were hearty, made with the vegetables that had been carefully grown and stored, the meat that had been salted and preserved. The work in the kitchen, though constant, wasn't rushed. It was an act of simple sustenance. There was nothing rushed about it. There was no great rush to get everything done, no frantic scrambling to prepare. The work was its own reward, a reminder of how the slow, steady process of living could feel so fulfilling in its own way. The conversations around the fire, now longer in the evenings, were filled with stories of past summers, of harvests gone by, of winters survived. The children, their eyes wide with the stories they had heard 1,000 times, still asked questions. They wanted to know about what had come before, about how things had been done in other years, how families had lived before them. And the adults, with their voices steady and their stories familiar, passed down the knowledge, the stories, and the lessons. There were no grand revelations, no great speeches, just quiet, steady sharing. The land continued to stretch forward in its slow, deliberate way. The trees, still green but not yet fully grown, seemed to mark the passage of time with their steady growth. The sun rose earlier and set later. The days felt heavier with the promise of what was to come, but no one hurried. No one rushed to bring summer fully into being. It came when it was ready. And when it did, the frontier families would be ready, just as they always had been, to carry on with the work that defined their lives. And so the summer crept in slowly, with the kind of quiet certainty that made it impossible to resist. The work continued, the days stretched on, and the rhythm of life moved forward. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was steady. It was the steady, patient movement that had always defined the frontier. There was still much to do, many tasks to complete, but in the quiet work of those days there was a simple joy. The land was alive, and the family was alive with it. And in that, there was a deep, unspoken satisfaction, the kind that came from knowing that in time, everything would come to fruition, just as it always had. The quiet promise of summer would soon be realized. But for now, there was still time, time to wait, time to watch, time to live in the rhythm of the land, as steady and unhurried as the seasons themselves. Summer, when it finally settled in, didn't bring with it a grand celebration. No fireworks, no loud claps of thunder announcing its presence. No, summer simply unfolded, a slow, steady arrival, as if it had been there all along, waiting in the wings. The days were now warm, long enough that the sun stretched lazily across the sky, its golden rays casting a soft warmth over the land. The air had that special weight to it, heavy with the scent of earth and growing things, of blossoms and grasses and the faint but unmistakable promise of abundance. But even in the warmth of summer's embrace, there was no rush. There was no frantic desire to do everything at once. The land had come alive, and now it was time to simply live with it, moving in step with the unhurried rhythm of the season. The work that had started in the early spring had come to fruition. The garden, now full and vibrant, yielded its harvest slowly. Tomatoes, peas, lettuce, beans, all of it ripening in its own time. Each plant a testament to the careful, patient labor that had gone into its care. And yet, there was no frantic energy about it. The picking was done calmly, deliberately, each item chosen at its perfect moment. There was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the rows of crops thrive, but no rush to pull everything in all at once. It wasn't about filling baskets with the spoils of summer as quickly as possible. It was about working with the land, understanding its rhythms, and harvesting when the time was right. The livestock, too, were part of this patient, unhurried summer. The cows, now fattened from the lush grass, grazed lazily in the fields. The chickens, once confined to their coops, now roamed freely, pecking at the ground for the insects that seemed to appear in abundance. The goats, playful and energetic, bounded around in their own carefree way, while the horses, free from the weight of winter coats, galloped with a kind of joy that only summer seemed to bring. The animals were not in a rush either. They grazed and rested in their own rhythm, moving from one task to the next, one moment of nourishment to another, without urgency. The cabins themselves, sturdy and well maintained, now stood in the full light of the sun, their walls warm to the touch, and the air inside thick with the smell of wood and food. The fire, though still lit in the evenings, was no longer the constant companion it had been in winter. Instead, the cool breeze from the open windows filled the cabin with a fresh, green scent, a reminder of the world outside. Meals were simpler now, fresh vegetables from the garden accompanying the meats that had been preserved in winter. There was a certain lightness to the food, a refreshing change from the heavy stews and root vegetables of the colder months. The meals, though humble, were made with the abundance of summer, and that was enough. The evenings stretched on, now filled with a quiet warmth that invited people to linger. The sun, though setting later, didn't do so abruptly. It sank slowly, as if reluctant to leave, casting long shadows across the land and bathing everything in a golden hue. The family, still working through their chores, would often pause in the evening light, the soft hum of insects filling the air. There was no hurry to finish, no great rush to wrap up the day. The work would get done in time, but for now, there was peace in the steady, familiar rhythm of it all. The children, having spent the long days helping with chores, would often find themselves drawn to the more carefree parts of summer. They would run through the fields, climb trees, and explore the edges of the forest. But even in their play, there was a connection to the land, a sense of living in harmony with it. Their games were simple, unstructured, and quiet. They didn't need grand adventures. The land itself was their playground, and they knew it as intimately as they knew their own home. There was, however, one task that always loomed large in Summer's quiet way: the preservation, the work of canning, salting, and drying the bounty of summer was a constant in the background, ever present, though not rushed. It was a necessary rhythm that kept the family sustained through the months to come. Jars were filled with peaches, beans, and tomatoes. Herbs were gathered, dried, and stored in cool, dark places. The meat that had been raised over the past months was carefully salted and packed away. It wasn't a frantic race to store everything before it spoiled. It was just part of the ongoing rhythm, another step toward the self sufficiency that had defined their lives. The work was done not out of desperation, but out of respect for the land and the effort it had taken to bring the summer's bounty to life. In the stillness of the long summer days, there was also time for reflection. The family, gathered together in the evening, would talk of the past, of winters survived, of seasons of struggle, of the early days when everything had been new and uncertain. These stories were told again and again, not for the sake of reliving hardships, but to remember the steady progress that had been made, the knowledge gained over time. The lessons of the past were always present, even in the carefree days of summer. There was always something to learn, something to pass on to the next generation. As the sun set each evening, casting its warm glow across the fields and the cabin, there was a deep, quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that life was moving forward. It wasn't fast, it wasn't flashy, but it was steady, and that steadiness had its own beauty. Summer, with all its promise, was simply another part of the cycle, another step in the unhurried dance of life on the frontier. And as the days stretched on, the family continued to live in tune with the land, waiting, watching, working, and always moving forward, one steady step at a time. As the days of summer stretched toward their inevitable end, the heat began to soften. The sun, though still warm, no longer held the relentless power it once had. The air felt different now, cooler in the early mornings and evenings, as if the land itself was beginning to shift once more. The fields, still full of life, now showed the subtle signs of change. The first fruits of the harvest had been brought in: the tomatoes, cucumbers, and berries that had ripened in the sun, but there was still much work to be done. The end of summer wasn't a dramatic farewell. It came quietly, in small changes, in the gradual softening of the days, in the way the leaves began to turn at the edges, hinting at the transformation that was coming. The pace of life, though steady throughout the summer, now seemed to slow just a little. There was less of the frantic work that had accompanied planting and the beginning of the season's growth. Now, it was a time of maintaining, of gathering, of ensuring that everything that had been worked for was brought in before the first frost came creeping. There was a quiet, palpable urgency, not in the frantic energy of the past, but in the careful awareness that autumn would be here soon, the days would shorten, the work of gathering and storing would become even more pressing. But for now, there was still time. The harvest was, of course, the focal point of this late summer work. Crops that had ripened slowly over the months now needed to be gathered before they spoiled. The apples, pears, and berries were carefully picked, stored in baskets or jars for future use. The vegetables, too, were brought in squash, pumpkins, beans, each one a sign of the steady progress that had been made through the growing season. Nothing was wasted. Everything was either consumed or preserved, a reflection of the careful, measured work that had begun in spring and would carry on through the coming winter. The livestock, too, needed attention as the season wound down. The animals, though content to graze in the summer heat, were now beginning to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. The cows were heavier now, the goats more content in their lazy afternoon grazing. The chickens, though still free to roam, were less energetic, as if sensing the coming shift in the seasons. Even the horses, their coats now sleek and shiny from the summer's work, slowed in their movements, preparing for the upcoming chill. And yet, through all of this, there was no great rush. The land, as it always had, moved in its own time. The work was done not out of a frantic desire to finish, but out of respect for the cycle that had come before. There was no frantic need to finish everything by a certain date. The work would get done when it got done, and whatever wasn't finished in time would wait. The family had learned long ago that life didn't follow a clock. It followed the rhythm of the land, and the land wasn't in any hurry. Even the cabin, now fully exposed to the changing seasons, seemed to take on a more reflective air. The warmth of summer still clung to its walls, but the evenings were beginning to carry a chill. The fire, which had been a small, comforting presence during the summer, now grew larger, more necessary as the nights began to stretch longer. There was a quiet comfort in the cabin's warmth, a reminder that even as the seasons changed, there was always a place to return to, always a refuge from the world outside. The meals, though still simple, began to reflect the shift in season. The last of the fresh vegetables were consumed first, but soon the preserved goods would take over the canned beans, the dried meats, the pickled vegetables. The work of preserving had paid off, and now the family would reap the benefits. The evenings, too, grew longer. As the sun sank behind the hills earlier each night, the family gathered inside. The heat of the day lingered in the walls of the cabin, but it was clear that the warmth of summer was fading. The conversations, once filled with talk of the summer's bounty and the excitement of harvest, now turned to the coming months. Winter, though far off, was already beginning to be on people's minds. There was no panic, no fear, just the quiet awareness that the work of survival was never really done. But for now, there was still time to prepare, time to finish the harvest, time to store the last of the food, time to bring in the final animals for slaughter or care. And so, as summer drew to a close, there was a quiet sense of completion. The family had done the work, had seen the land through another season, and now they were ready for the next phase. It wasn't a time of great celebration. There were no loud cheers, no big events to mark the end of summer. Instead, it was a time of quiet satisfaction. The work had been done, the land had provided. The family was prepared for what was to come. The first chill in the air was a reminder that the cycle was always moving forward, that the seasons never stopped, never rested. But for now, there was no need for hurry. The quiet days of late summer gave way to the preparation for the coming fall and winter. The work would continue, but for now, it was enough to know that they had met the land's demands, that they had done what was necessary to survive the coming cold. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't exciting, but it was everything. And as the days of summer finally came to an end, the family on the frontier could rest in the quiet knowledge that they had done their part, that they had lived in harmony with the land. The season shift was inevitable, but it would come gently, slowly. The rhythm of the land would continue, and the family, ever watchful, would continue to move with it, one season at a time. And so, with the gentle fading of summer's warmth, the land entered its final phase of transformation. The cool breezes that began to nip at the edges of the day became the heralds of winter's return, but there was no panic, no mad dash to prepare, no frantic push to finish everything in a rush. The work had been done, the harvest had been brought in, the animals had been cared for. The cabin, now bathed in the dim light of shorter days, was ready for the long nights ahead. The quiet rhythm of life that had carried the family through each season remained steady, unyielding, and patient. Winter's return was not a grand event. It was not an overwhelming force that swooped in all at once. No, it crept back, like an old friend slowly making their presence known, just as it always had. The first hard frost would arrive quietly, dusting the earth with the faintest layer of ice. The cold air would bite at the morning, but it would not rush. It never did. Slowly, it seeped in, gently wrapping itself around the land, just as it had wrapped itself around the family for every winter before. The cabin, sturdy and warm, felt like an anchor against the gathering chill. The fire, now burning with more intensity, provided the heat that made the long nights bearable. There was no need for excess, no need for grandeur. The family had everything they needed: the stockpiles of food, the wood stacked high for the fire, the layers of blankets waiting for the inevitable cold nights. Every step had been taken, every task completed. And now, as the nights grew longer and the days shorter, there was nothing left to do but wait for winter to fully settle in. The work, while never truly finished, slowed to a lull. The animals were brought into their shelters, checked for the signs of cold weather that could cause trouble. The last of the garden's produce was either stored away or eaten, leaving behind only the preserved goods that would keep them going. The stored jars of fruit, the dried meat, the beans and potatoes, they were the reminders of a summer well spent. Each jar of preserves, each sack of dried herbs was not just food, it was the culmination of months of labor, a testament to the family's ability to read the land and work with it, to understand its cycles and live in harmony with them. Even in the slow, seemingly uneventful days of winter's early arrival, there was a quiet satisfaction. The family knew the routine, knew the rhythm. The fire would burn through the long nights, the wind would howl outside, but they would remain inside, warm and together. The pace of life slowed again, as it always did when winter settled in. There was no urgency, no need to hurry. The land had given them what they needed, and now, in the quiet of winter, they would take a breath. There was, of course, work to be done, mending clothes, repairing tools, keeping watch over the animals, but it wasn't the same work as before. There was no frantic effort to prepare for the unknown. It was simply the maintenance of what had already been done. It was the quiet observation of the land in its deep winter slumber, the steady knowledge that the next season would come when it was ready. As the final remnants of autumn faded, the family could rest in the certainty that they had done their part. They had worked with the land. They had lived by its rhythm. They had prepared for the cold, and they would survive it just as they always had. The slow, steady dance of the seasons had played out once more, and though it was a cycle that would continue on long after they were gone, for now they were part of it, and in that there was peace. The days ahead would be quiet, and that was okay. The pace of life had slowed again. The earth, wrapped in its blanket of snow, would rest just as the family had learned to rest. And as winter settled in for good, the world outside would grow still. But inside the cabin, There was warmth, there was peace, there was the soft, unhurried rhythm of life, one season gently blending into the next. And so they carried on in quiet resilience, waiting for what would come when the first signs of spring whispered softly in the distance. The end of the year was not an ending at all. It was just another pause in a never ending cycle. The work, the patience, the quiet care, they would all be needed again when the seasons turned once more. But for now, there was rest. The work was done. The land had been honored, and in the deep quiet of winter's embrace, the family, like the land itself, would wait for the next season, for the next step in the cycle of life. In the stillness, there was a quiet understanding that no matter what came next, they would be ready. And with that, as the fire burned softly in the hearth and the wind whispered through the trees outside, the family settled into the long night, knowing that their quiet resilience was enough. Enough to survive the cold, enough to see them through the seasons, enough to keep moving forward, one unhurried step at a time.